The mysterious encounter. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow as he tightened the bolts on a malfunctioning mining rig. Life on Colony Delta 47 was rough, and solitude was its defining feature. Humans came here not for comfort, but to work hard and earn enough credits to retire somewhere better. Daniel liked the quiet, though. It gave him time to tinker with machines and lose himself in the hum of engines. The silence of the barren desert was suddenly broken by a deafening roar overhead. Daniel looked up and saw streaks of light slicing through the dark, star-filled sky. At first, he thought it was a meteor shower, but the way the lights zigzagged told a different story. It was a ship, and it was crashing. A violent explosion followed, lighting up the horizon in orange and red. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his gear and jumped into his rover. The colony's protocols were clear. Do not investigate strange objects, especially alien ones. But something inside him stirred. He couldn't let it go. Maybe someone needed help. The drive was bumpy and tense, with dust clouds rising as he sped toward the crash site. His headlights eventually revealed a smoking crater, and in its center lay a sleek alien craft. Its metallic surface shimmered under the moonlight, dented and scarred from the crash. Sparks flew from its edges, and Daniel could feel the heat even from several meters away. Cautiously, he approached, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face what, or who, might be inside. The ship's hatch hissed and groaned as it opened slightly, releasing a puff of white gas. Daniel froze, gripping his wrench tightly, unsure whether to run or stay. Then he saw her. She stumbled out of the ship, clutching her side. Her skin was a radiant shade of sapphire, glowing faintly as though lit from within. She was tall and slender, with sharp, elegant features that made her look more like a sculpture than a living being. Her silver eyes locked onto Daniel, filled with a mix of pain and determination. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel's mind raced. This was an alien, someone from a species he had only heard about in passing. Her kind, the Varians, were known for their cold demeanor and strict adherence to logic. Yet here she was, vulnerable and bleeding. "Help me," she said, her voice soft but clear. It startled Daniel. Her accent was strange, but her words were unmistakably in English. He hesitated. Helping her could mean trouble, big trouble, but he couldn't just walk away. "Hold on," he said, stepping forward. He dropped his wrench and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'll help you." The alien woman winced as she tried to stand straight. "You are human?" she asked, studying him with weary eyes. "Last time I checked," Daniel replied, trying to lighten the mood despite the situation. He quickly wrapped her arm around his shoulders and supported her weight. She was lighter than he expected, almost too light, as though gravity barely held her down. He guided her to the rover, glancing nervously at the sky. If anyone else saw the crash or reported it, both of them could be in serious danger. The colony wasn't known for being kind to outsiders, especially alien ones. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as he secured her in the passenger seat. Her voice was weak, but laced with curiosity. Daniel paused, looking at her for a moment. "Because you need it," he said simply. "And because I can." As they drove back to his workshop on the outskirts of the colony, the alien woman drifted in and out of consciousness. Daniel noticed the intricate markings on her arms, glowing faintly like constellations. He wondered what they meant. Every detail about her was fascinating and strange, yet there was something deeply human in her expression, a vulnerability that made him want to protect her. They arrived at his workshop just before dawn. Daniel carried her inside, laying her gently on a makeshift cot. He grabbed a medkit and did his best to clean and bandage her wounds, though he wasn't sure if human medical supplies would work on her physiology. She murmured something in her language, too soft for him to understand, before falling into a deep sleep. As the sun rose, Daniel sat nearby, watching her with a mix of awe and apprehension. What was she doing here? Why had her ship crashed? And why did she seem so different from the cold, calculating Virians he had heard about? The questions buzzed in his mind, but one thing was certain. This encounter was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could imagine. A growing connection. Zilura awoke to the sound of tools clinking against metal. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, along with the acrid scent of oil and burnt circuits. She blinked, her silver eyes adjusting to the dim light. The human was sitting a few feet away, tinkering with a device that looked like a hybrid between a drone and a toaster. "Good, you're awake," Daniel said without looking up. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of relief in his tone. Zilura shifted slightly, feeling the stiffness in her side where he had bandaged her. The pain was dull now, and the bleeding had stopped. She studied her surroundings. The room was cluttered with tools, half-built machines, and scraps of metal. It was chaotic yet oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the sterile orderliness of Virian ships. "You helped me," she said slowly, her voice still weak. Her species wasn't accustomed to expressing gratitude, but she felt compelled to acknowledge his actions. "Why?" Daniel glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't we cover this already? You were hurt. It's what we do. Help people." "Your kind's compassion is illogical," Zilura replied, her tone almost clinical. "It serves no benefit to you." Daniel chuckled, setting down his tools. "Maybe not. But if I waited around for something to benefit me before doing it, life would be pretty dull." Zilura frowned. His reasoning was alien to her, yet it intrigued her. Humans were notorious across the galaxy for their emotional unpredictability, their willingness to risk themselves for others. She had always dismissed it as recklessness. But now, sitting in this cramped workshop with this strange human, she began to wonder if there was more to it. "Your injuries aren't too bad," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "You'll heal up fine, but you might want to stay out of sight for a while. The colony's not exactly friendly to visitors." Zilura's expression hardened. "I am not here by choice." "Yeah, I figured as much," Daniel replied, leaning back against a workbench. "That crash wasn't exactly a smooth landing. What happened?" For a moment, Zilura hesitated. Trust was not something her species gave easily, and revealing too much could endanger her mission. But something in Daniel's steady gaze reassured her. He wasn't just curious. He genuinely wanted to help. "My ship was sabotaged," she admitted finally. "I was being hunted." "Hunted? By who?" Daniel leaned forward, his interest piqued. "My own people," Zilura said, her voice laced with bitterness. "I broke one of our sacred laws. To them, I am a traitor." Daniel whistled softly. "That's rough. What law did you break?" Zilura hesitated, the weight of her confession pressing down on her. "I interacted with a human. I studied your kind, learned your ways. Such connections are forbidden. My people view emotions as a weakness, and humans are seen as dangerous." Daniel couldn't help but laugh, though it was more out of disbelief than humor. "Dangerous? Us? We're not exactly the galaxy's top predators." "You misunderstand," Zilura said, her tone serious. "Your emotions, your capacity for connection and resilience, are what they fear. My species values logic above all else. To them, emotions are a flaw, a distraction from reason." Daniel shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "Well, I hate to break it to your people, but emotions are kind of what make us human. They're not always pretty, but they're what keep us going." Zilura studied him, her sharp features softening. There was a sincerity in his words that she couldn't ignore. She had spent years observing humans from afar, but sitting here with one, she began to see the depth of what she had only glimpsed before. As the hours passed, Daniel shared stories of his life on the colony, his struggles, his dreams, and the reasons he had chosen such a lonely existence. In turn, Zilura opened up about her mission and the consequences of her actions. She spoke of the fear that had driven her to escape, the doubt that gnawed at her, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find answers among the very people her kind feared. Their conversation was interrupted by a faint beeping sound. Silara tensed, her eyes darting toward the source. Daniel followed her gaze and saw a small blinking device tucked into the folds of her clothing. "What is that?" he asked. "A tracker," Silara said grimly. "They found me." Daniel sprang into action, grabbing a toolkit and examining the device. "Can we disable it?" Silara shook her head. "It's not that simple. The signal is embedded in my biometrics. They'll keep coming until I'm captured or dead." "Well, that's not happening on my watch," Daniel said firmly. He grabbed a nearby drone and began modifying it. "We're going to give them a wild goose chase." As Daniel worked, Silara watched him with a mix of admiration and confusion. His determination, his refusal to give up, was unlike anything she had encountered. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. Within minutes, Daniel had rigged the tracker to the drone. "This should buy us some time," he said, sending the drone flying out into the desert. "Now we figure out our next move." Silara nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: this human had already changed the course of her life, and she wasn't ready to let that go. The sacred law. The desert winds howled outside Daniel's workshop, but the tension inside was far more suffocating. Silara sat cross-legged on the cot, her sapphire blue skin catching the dim glow of the single overhead bulb. Her silver eyes bore into Daniel as he paced, trying to make sense of what she had just told him. "You mean to tell me," Daniel started, running a hand through his hair, "that your entire species has outlawed emotions, like completely banned them?" Silara inclined her head. "Not entirely. Emotions exist, of course, but they are seen as primitive impulses. They are suppressed, controlled, and, when necessary, erased. It is the foundation of Virian society." Daniel stopped pacing and stared at her. "Erased? How do you even erase emotions?" "We use neural calibration," Silara explained, her tone as steady as if she were describing the weather. "It is a procedure that adjusts the brain's responses, eliminating emotional interference. It ensures clarity and logic." Daniel let out a low whistle. "That's horrifying." "To you, perhaps," Silara replied. "To us, it is survival. Long ago, emotions led to chaos, wars, destruction, the near extinction of our kind. Our ancestors decided that logic was the only path forward." "And what about you?" Daniel asked, his voice softer now. "You don't seem like someone who's had all her emotions erased." Silara hesitated, the faint glow of her skin dimming as she looked down. "I was different. From a young age, I questioned our ways. I was told it was a flaw, something I would grow out of. But it only grew stronger." She met his gaze, her silver eyes filled with something Daniel couldn't quite place. "When I first encountered humans, I felt something. Curiosity. Awe. It was overwhelming." Daniel pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "So, what happened?" Silara took a deep breath. "I was part of a research mission, sent to observe your kind from afar. Our task was to gather data, understand your technology, and assess potential threats. But the more I observed, the more I saw something my people had forgotten. Resilience, creativity, and connection. I began to feel emotions I had never experienced before. And then I made the ultimate mistake." Daniel leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What mistake?" "I made contact," Silara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a small act, speaking to a human trader on a remote outpost. He was injured, and I offered assistance. He thanked me, smiled at me. That moment, it changed everything." Daniel couldn't help but smile. "Sounds like a decent guy." "He was," Silara said, her expression softening. "But when I returned to my people, they discovered what I had done. They saw it as a contamination, a betrayal of our values. I was arrested, interrogated, and sentenced to neural calibration. They wanted to erase my connection to that moment. Daniel's stomach churned at the thought. But you escaped. Yes, Silara said, her voice firm. I fled before the procedure could be completed. I stole a ship and ran. For months, I've been hunted, forced to hide. But I couldn't stay away from humans. I needed to understand what made your kind so different. Daniel leaned back, absorbing her story. It was hard to imagine living in a world where emotions were treated as a disease. And now you're here, he said. What's your plan? What are you hoping to find? Silara hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. I don't have a plan, she admitted. But I believe humans hold the key to something my people have lost. Your emotions are not weaknesses. They are strengths. If I can prove that, maybe I can change our way of life. Daniel let out a slow breath. That's a lot of pressure to put on one species. We're not exactly perfect, you know. Perfection is not the goal, Silara said. Understanding is. Before Daniel could respond, the workshop's proximity alarm blared. He jumped to his feet, rushing to the control panel. The screen displayed a grainy image of two figures approaching the building, their outlines illuminated by the rover's floodlights. They found us, Silara said, standing up. Her voice was calm, but her glowing markings flared brighter, a sign of her heightened state of alertness. Daniel grabbed a plasma wrench and handed her a small, modified energy pistol he had salvaged. I thought your tracker was gone. It is, Silara said, gripping the pistol with practiced ease. They must have traced the ship's residual energy signature. I underestimated their persistence. Daniel swore under his breath. Well, we're not going down without a fight. As the intruders drew closer, Daniel quickly shut off the workshop's lights, plunging the room into darkness. He and Silara crouched behind a workbench, their breaths shallow. The door hissed open, and two Virian soldiers stepped inside, their glowing armor casting eerie reflections across the room. They moved with precision, scanning the area with weapons drawn. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he exchanged a glance with Silara. She gave him a subtle nod, her expression unreadable but resolute. Whatever happened next, they were in this together. The proposal. The workshop was eerily quiet after the encounter with the Virian soldiers. Daniel leaned against a metal beam, catching his breath. Silara stood nearby, inspecting the modified energy pistol he had handed her earlier. The faint glow of her markings pulsed in the dim light, a visual reminder of the tension hanging between them. They'll send more, Silara said, breaking the silence. Her tone was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. We cannot stay here. Daniel nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. No kidding. But running isn't exactly a long-term plan. Sooner or later, we're going to run out of places to hide. Silara set the weapon down and turned to face him. That's why we must stop running. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Stop running. What's the alternative? Just surrender. No. Silara's silver eyes met his, sharp with determination. We fight, but not with weapons. Daniel tilted his head, confused. Then how? Silara hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. By challenging the very foundation of my people's beliefs, by showing them what I've learned, through you. Daniel blinked, taken aback. Me? What are you talking about? Silara stepped closer, her voice steady but earnest. My people have always seen emotions as dangerous, chaotic forces, but humans thrive because of them. Your capacity for connection, resilience, and empathy. These are the traits that make your species strong. If I can demonstrate that, perhaps I can change their perspective. Daniel stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You want to. What? Bring me back to your world and give some kind of speech about the power of feelings. I don't think I'm exactly qualified for that. Silara shook her head. It's not just about words. It's about actions. You've already shown me what humans are capable of. Your courage, your ingenuity, your willingness to help a stranger at great personal risk. These are the qualities my people need to see." Daniel let out a dry laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm just a guy who fixes machines. I'm not some hero, and I'm definitely not a diplomat." "Why me?" "Because you are human," Silara said simply, "and because I trust you." Those last 3 words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Trust wasn't something he was used to hearing, especially from someone who barely knew him, let alone an alien fugitive. He leaned against the workbench, rubbing his temples. "Okay, let's say I agree to this," he said finally. "How exactly do you plan to convince your people? Aren't they, already hunting you down?" "They are," Silara admitted, "but my actions have drawn attention, both positive and negative. There are those among my people who question our traditions, who believe change is necessary. If we can reach them, we may have a chance." "And if we can't?" Daniel asked, crossing his arms. Silara's expression darkened. "Then they will likely sentence us both to neural calibration. Or worse." Daniel let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a risk." "It is," Silara said, "but doing nothing is riskier. If my people continue down this path, they will stagnate. They may survive, but they will never truly live." Daniel couldn't argue with that. He had seen enough of the galaxy to know that survival without purpose was no life at all. Still, the idea of walking into a society that viewed emotions as a crime made his stomach churn. "I don't know, Silara," he said after a long pause. "This sounds like a suicide mission." "It might be," she admitted, "but it's a mission worth taking. And I believe you're the only one who can help me." Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "You really know how to put a guy on the spot, don't you?" Silara tilted her head slightly, a faint glimmer of humor in her otherwise stoic expression. "Is that a yes?" Daniel groaned, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine. But if this goes south, I'm blaming you." "Agreed," Silara said with a rare, almost smile. "We will leave tonight." As the hours passed, they worked together to prepare for the journey. Daniel retrofitted Silara's damaged ship, using scavenged parts from his workshop to enhance its stealth capabilities. Silara mapped out a route to her homeworld, carefully avoiding known patrol zones. "You're sure about this?" Daniel asked as they loaded supplies into the ship. "No second thoughts." Silara paused, looking at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "I've spent my entire life suppressing doubt," she said. "For the first time, I am certain of what I must do." Daniel nodded, unable to argue with that. He climbed into the cockpit, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. The ship hummed to life, and Silara took the co-pilot's seat beside him. As they lifted off into the star-filled sky, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger than himself. But one glance at Silara's determined expression reminded him why he had agreed to this. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Escape to the stars. The roar of the engines was deafening as Silara's ship lifted off from the barren surface of the colony. Daniel gripped the control panel tightly, his knuckles turning white as the small craft shuddered under the strain. Silara's steady hands flew over the controls, her silver eyes scanning the holographic display in front of her. "Stealth mode engage," she announced. Her voice was calm, but the glow of her markings betrayed her heightened state of alertness. "We've left the colony's airspace, but the Varian fleet won't be far behind." Daniel glanced at the radar. Blips were already appearing on the edge of the screen. 3 ships in pursuit. "Looks like they're not wasting any time," he said grimly. "Any brilliant ideas?" Silara's lips pressed into a thin line. "We cannot outgun them, but we can outthink them." "Great," Daniel muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because thinking always beats missiles." Silara shot him a pointed look. "Humor will not help us survive, human." Daniel smirked despite the situation. "You're starting to sound like me." "Focus," she replied, though the corner of her mouth twitched slightly, betraying a hint of amusement. The ship jolted violently as the first volley of plasma bolts streaked past them, lighting up the darkness of space. Silara yanked the controls to the side, sending the craft into a sharp barrel roll. Daniel's stomach lurched, but he managed to keep his grip. "Shields holding," Silara reported, "but we won't last long in a direct engagement." Daniel scanned the controls, searching for anything that might give them an edge. His eyes landed on a schematic of the ship, showing a storage bay filled with spare parts and discarded equipment. An idea sparked in his mind. "Silara, do we have access to the cargo bay from here?" he asked. She nodded, not taking her eyes off the display. "Yes." "Why?" "I've got an idea," he said, unstrapping himself from his seat. "Keep them busy." "Busy," Silara repeated, her tone skeptical. "They are attempting to destroy us, Daniel." "Exactly," he replied with a grin. "And we're going to give them something to shoot at." Before she could argue, Daniel dashed to the back of the ship. The cargo bay was a chaotic mess of crates, tools, and spare parts, exactly what he needed. Working quickly, he rigged together a cluster of decoy drones using scavenged components and a handful of explosive charges. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. "Silara, opening the cargo bay in 3, 2, 1, he shouted into the comm. The ship's rear hatch hissed open, and the drones shot out into the void. Daniel watched on a small monitor as they scattered in different directions, each emitting a bright heat signature. "Decoys deployed," Silara confirmed, her voice tinged with surprise. "Their targeting systems are confused. They're splitting their formation." Daniel grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Told you thinking beats missiles." "Do not celebrate yet," Silara warned. "We still need to escape the patrol zone." Daniel returned to the cockpit just in time to see the Varian ships veer off toward the decoys. The radar screen cleared, leaving only their lone craft hurtling through the stars. "Nice flying," he said, collapsing into his seat. "Your ingenuity was commendable," Silara replied, her tone almost grudging. "But this is far from over." She was right. Their ship's fuel reserves were dangerously low after the chase, and the Varians wouldn't stay distracted for long. Silara pulled up a star map, highlighting a nearby system. "There," she said, pointing to a small, uncharted planet on the edge of the map. "We can land there to refuel and make repairs." Daniel squinted at the map. "Are you sure? That place looks like it's in the middle of nowhere." "That is precisely why it is our best option," Silara said. "The Varians will not expect us to hide in such an inhospitable location." Reluctantly, Daniel nodded. "All right, let's do it." The descent onto the planet was rough. The atmosphere was thick with storms, and visibility was near zero. Lightning crackled outside the cockpit windows, illuminating jagged mountain peaks and endless stretches of barren rock. The ship groaned under the strain, but Silara's expert piloting kept them steady. They finally touched down in a sheltered canyon, the ship settling onto a rocky outcrop. Daniel stepped out into the howling winds, shielding his face from the grit and dust. The air was thin but breathable, and the landscape was unlike anything he had ever seen, alien and beautiful in its desolation. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered as Silara joined him. "It is not ideal," she admitted, "but it will suffice." As they worked together to assess the ship's damage, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but the canyon remained empty. Still, the sense of unease gnawed at him. "You feel that?" he asked, breaking the silence. Silara nodded, her glowing markings dimming slightly. "We are not alone." Before Daniel could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, and a massive structure began to emerge from the canyon floor. It was ancient and otherworldly, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and glow. "What the hell is that?" Daniel breathed, his voice barely audible over the hum. Silara's expression was unreadable, but her voice was steady. Something very old and very powerful. Daniel took a cautious step closer, his heart pounding. Whatever they had stumbled upon, it was unlike anything he had ever encountered. And somehow, he knew it was connected to the journey they had just begun. The trial on Silara's world. The Varian capital was nothing like Daniel had imagined. He had expected a sterile, lifeless place dominated by cold logic, but instead, the city sprawled in every direction, a tapestry of towering spires and glowing pathways. The structures shimmered with faint, pulsing light, as if the entire city was alive and breathing. Yet despite its beauty, there was an oppressive stillness to the air, a lack of the vibrant energy that defined human settlements. "This is your home?" Daniel asked, his voice low as the ship descended onto a landing platform. "It was," Silara replied. Her silver eyes flickered with something unspoken. Nostalgia, perhaps, or regret. "But now it is the heart of my trial." Daniel glanced at her. She was calm, her markings dimmed to a faint glow, but he could see the tension in the way her fingers gripped the armrest. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We could still run." Silara shook her head. "Running will change nothing. If we are to succeed, we must face them." The landing platform hissed open, and a group of Varian officials awaited them. They were clad in flowing silver robes that reflected the light around them, their expressions cold and unreadable. Daniel noticed that their skin, like Silara's, glowed faintly, but their markings were far more subdued, controlled, like everything else about them. Silara stepped forward, her posture straight and unyielding. Daniel followed, feeling out of place in his worn boots and dusty jacket. The officials regarded him with thinly veiled disdain, but none of them spoke. "Silara, daughter of House Vinar," one of them said finally, his voice smooth and clipped. "You have returned to stand trial for your crimes. Do you acknowledge the charges?" "I do," Silara said, her tone steady. "And you bring this human with you as part of your defense." The official's gaze shifted to Daniel, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I do," Silara repeated. "He is the proof that our way is flawed, that emotions are not the weakness we believe them to be." The official raised an eyebrow. "We shall see. Follow us." The trial took place in a grand chamber at the center of the city. The room was vast and circular, with a glowing crystalline floor that reflected the light from above. The Varian Council sat in a raised semicircle, their faces obscured by shimmering veils. Around the edges of the chamber, dozens of observers watched in silence, their expressions neutral but curious. Daniel stood beside Silara in the center of the room, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. The council's leader, a stern figure with an air of authority, began to speak. "Silara, you stand accused of violating our most sacred law, the suppression of emotional interference. You have not only allowed yourself to succumb to such impulses, but you have also brought an outsider into our midst to justify your actions. What do you have to say for yourself?" Silara stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "I say that our sacred law is flawed. It was created to protect us, but it has blinded us to the truth. Emotions are not a weakness, they are a strength, and this human is living proof." The chamber buzzed with faint murmurs, quickly silenced by the council leader. "Proof," he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You expect us to believe that this creature represents strength?" Daniel bristled but held his tongue. Silara, however, was unshaken. "He is more than a creature. He is a being of courage, creativity, and compassion, qualities we have lost in our pursuit of logic. It is these qualities that allow him to thrive where we would falter." The council leader's gaze turned to Daniel. "And what do you have to say, human? Do you truly believe your emotions make you superior?" Daniel stepped forward, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I don't think it's about being superior," he said, his voice steady despite the pressure. "It's about balance. Emotions aren't always pretty. They can be messy, and they can lead to mistakes. But they're also what drive us to protect each other, to create, to keep going even when things seem impossible. The council members whispered among themselves, their veils shimmering as they turned to one another. The leader raised a hand to silence them, his focus still on Daniel. "You speak of balance," he said, "yet your species has waged countless wars, destroyed entire ecosystems, and continues to act irrationally. How do you explain such contradictions?" Daniel took a deep breath. "We're not perfect. Far from it. But it's our imperfections that push us to do better. Every mistake we make teaches us something, and every time we fall, we get back up. That's what makes us strong." The chamber fell silent. The council leader leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You make an intriguing argument," he said finally, "but words are not enough. If you wish to prove your point, you must face the trial of unity." Silara's markings flared briefly. The trial of unity has not been invoked in centuries. "Because no one has dared challenge our laws in centuries," the leader replied. He turned to Daniel. "If you and Silara wish to prove that emotions are a strength, you must survive the trial together. If you fail, your argument will be invalid, and the consequences will be severe." Daniel glanced at Silara, who met his gaze with a mixture of determination and concern. He nodded. "We'll do it." The council leader gestured to the guards. "Prepare the chamber." As the guards led them away, Daniel felt a knot of apprehension tightening in his chest. "What exactly is the trial of unity?" he asked. Silara's expression was grim. "It is a test designed to break us, physically, mentally, and emotionally. It will push us to our limits and force us to rely on each other completely." "Sounds like fun," Daniel muttered, though his voice lacked its usual humor. "Any advice?" Silara placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Trust yourself, and trust me." As they stepped into the trial chamber, the doors closed behind them with a resounding boom. Whatever lay ahead, Daniel knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The ultimate test. The trial chamber was an enormous cavernous space that seemed to defy logic. The walls shimmered with cascading lights that moved like water, and the floor was an ever-shifting maze of platforms and glowing pathways. It was as if the chamber itself was alive, testing its challengers before they even began. Daniel and Silara stood side by side at the center of the room, surrounded by an eerie silence. The council members observed from a high balcony, their veiled faces impassive as they looked down at the pair. "What exactly are we walking into?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "The trial of unity adapts to its participants," Silara explained, her silver eyes scanning the chamber. "It will draw on our fears, our weaknesses, and our bond. It is designed to expose any flaw in our connection." "Fantastic," Daniel muttered. "So basically, it's going to try and tear us apart." Silara nodded. "Yes, and we must not let it succeed." A booming voice echoed through the chamber, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "The trial of unity begins now." Without warning, the floor beneath them shifted, sending Daniel and Silara tumbling apart. A glowing barrier rose between them, separating them into two distinct paths. Daniel scrambled to his feet, but Silara was already out of sight. "Silara," he shouted, panic lacing his voice. "I am here," her voice replied, calm but distant. "The trial has begun. Stay focused, Daniel." Daniel's path. The path ahead of Daniel was a dizzying series of floating platforms, each separated by a gaping void. The air shimmered with heat, and the sound of cracking glass filled his ears. He hesitated at the edge of the first platform, looking down into the endless abyss below. A voice, soft, familiar, and haunting, echoed around him. "Why do you even try, Daniel? You're just a man with a wrench. What can you possibly achieve here?" It was his own voice. Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself to ignore the doubt creeping into his mind. "I've made it this far," he muttered. "I'm not stopping now." He jumped to the next platform, barely landing on the edge. The surface cracked beneath his feet, but he steadied himself and kept moving. Each jump was harder than the last, the platform smaller and more unstable. The voice of doubt followed him, whispering every fear he'd ever had. His failures, his regrets, the lives he couldn't save. But then he remembered Silara, her determination, her belief in him. That thought pushed him forward, even when his legs ached and his lungs burned. Silara's path. Silara found herself in a dark corridor that pulsed with an unnatural light. The walls seemed to close in as she moved forward, and the air grew colder with every step. She could hear faint whispers, voices from her past, echoing her deepest fears. "Emotions make you weak," the voices said. "You've betrayed your people. You've doomed yourself, and him." She stopped, her glowing markings dimming as doubt threatened to overwhelm her. But then she thought of Daniel, the human who had risked everything to help her, who had shown her the strength and vulnerability. "I am not weak," she said aloud, her voice steady. "I am stronger because of him." As she continued, the corridor opened into a chamber filled with glowing orbs, each one pulsing with a memory. Silara reached out and touched one, and a vision of Daniel appeared, leaping across platforms in the void. He looked exhausted but determined. "Stay strong, Daniel," she whispered. "We're almost there." The final test. After what felt like hours, the barriers between their paths dissolved, and Daniel and Silara found themselves facing each other in a new chamber. It was empty save for a single glowing pedestal at its center. On it rested a crystalline orb, radiating a soft, pulsating light. "What now?" Daniel asked, breathing heavily. "The trial's final test," Silara said, her voice tinged with both relief and apprehension. "We must activate the orb together. It will test our bond, our unity." Daniel approached the pedestal, standing opposite Silara. "What happens if we fail?" "The orb will destroy us," she said simply. "No pressure," Daniel muttered, extending his hand toward the orb. Silara mirrored his movement, their fingers brushing as they touched the crystal. The moment their hands made contact, a surge of energy coursed through them. The chamber dissolved around them, replaced by a storm of memories and emotions. They saw each other's lives in vivid detail. Daniel's struggles on Earth, his loneliness on the colony, his quiet hope for something more. Silara's rigid upbringing, her doubts about her people's ways, her fascination with humanity. It was overwhelming, but neither pulled away. "Do you see?" Silara's voice echoed in Daniel's mind. "This is why I believe in you." "And this," Daniel replied, "is why I believe in us." The storm began to fade, replaced by a soft glow that enveloped them both. When the chamber reappeared, the orb was gone, and the council stood before them, their veils shimmering. "You have passed the trial of unity," the council leader announced. His voice was tinged with something new, respect. "You have shown that emotions, when balanced by trust and understanding, can be a source of strength. Perhaps we have been blind to this truth." Silara's markings flared brightly, her expression one of quiet triumph. Daniel gave her a tired smile. "Told you we could do it." Epilogue. The Varians did not change overnight, but the trial planted a seed. Silara and Daniel became symbols of a new way forward, ambassadors of unity between their species. As they left the Varian capital, Daniel glanced at Silara. "So," he said, "what's next?" Silara smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "The stars, Daniel, the stars."